Hey everyone, it's reading time with Pickle. This probably isn't what you were expecting. I know I've previously been reading some fiction novels and have not been updating that recently. A large part of that is because I've been in a master's program over the last 1 to 2-ish years, and I'm about to graduate. Ideally, or I am planning to apply to several PhD programs this coming fall. And ideally, I would be able to continue my higher education. So I've been really focused on that. One thing that I have been spending a lot of my time with is studying the construct of psychological resilience. And psychological resilience is something that I hope to continue to study after graduating from my master's program, hopefully after being accepted to some PhD programs in IO psychology. So just for the purposes of documenting my own study, helping me study, helping me learn to think things through and to talk to an audience as I think things through. I just wanted to record a study session, typically how I study. In this case, I'm working on a project of a systematic review of resilience scales. So essentially, all of the different questionnaires or measures or assessments that researchers have designed to measure this theoretical definition of what is psychological resilience? What does that mean? What are all of the different ways that researchers have come up with tests to measure that over the last, let's say, in this case, we're going to do over the last 7 years. So what we're doing is we're reviewing all of the extant literature on scales for resilience. And we're really assessing how valid and how reliable are these instruments actually? Are the tests being used in research to measure psychological resilience tests that we can rely upon, tests that will accurately measure what we're hoping it to measure, in this case, psychological resilience. So what I'm going to do today is we're going to read an article together, and I'm kind of going to go through how I read articles, how I take notes as I read articles, how I love to highlight. So all the different codes that I assign to the different colors as I highlight. And then we are going to complete this quote unquote data sheet together. And this is what's going to help us get a better idea of, okay, is the measure of psychological resilience used in this article any good, or is it not so great? And if it's good, why is it good? What evidence of validity exists or reliability exists? If it is not so great, why is it not so great? So yeah, that's what we're going to do today. I will try to narrate my thoughts as I go along. And hopefully this will be interesting to some people. I understand if it's not interesting to most. Again, this is just to help me document myself as I train to hopefully become an IO psychologist in the future. So when reading an article, the first thing that I do is I'll read through the abstract. Then I will quickly go through each section to get a good idea of everything that I am in for, if that makes any sense. What to expect is what to be expecting as I'm reading through this article. So in this article, we'll start with the abstract, and the abstract is basically, it's a very short summary. It's about 150 words, a very short summary of what the research in the article, what questions the research intends to answer, I guess what methods are used to come to those answers, and ultimately what the research found. what the research design is, what the research found. So in this case, let's see. The resiliency scale for young adults, RSYA, is presented as an upward extension of the resiliency scales for children and adolescents. So immediately it's tying these two scales together, an upward extension. The resiliency scale for young adults is based on the three-factor model of personal resiliency, including mastery, relatedness, and emotional reactivity. Several stages of scale development and studies leading to the current RSYA are described that provide construct validity, i.e. internal consistency, confirmatory factor analysis, and convergent divergent validity. Support for the three-factor structure and 10 subscales of this measure for young adults. I'm sorry, but let's go through that sentence again. Several stages of the scale development and studies leading to the current RSYA are described that provide construct validity support for the three-factor structure and 10 subscales of this measure for young adults who are attending college. This work is a step in a longer-term project of translating the constructs of personal resiliency for application across the lifespan. Give me a few minutes. I'm going to reread this real quick internally and then think it through. Okay, so what it's saying is this is a study about a scale that measures resiliency in young adults. The scale is an extension from an existing scale that measures resiliency for children and adolescents. It's based on three factors of personal resiliency. So they're saying personal resiliency is a combination of these three things, of mastery, of relatedness, and of emotional reactivity. And this is how we're going to prove to you that our scale is actually accurately measuring mastery, relatedness, emotional reactivity, that our scale can reliably measure those things. That's what this article is about. And this article is also part of a longer-term project of translating constructs of personal resiliency for application across the lifespan. So we're not looking at resiliency at one moment in time. This is building towards resiliency throughout an individual's entire life. So keywords: resiliency, resilience, mastery, relatedness, emotional reactivity, young adults, okay? Now, first, we start with the introduction. The introduction is typically a literature review, if it does not include a literature review. So this introduction followed by a literature review. So the introduction is like the backdrop. Why is this research necessary? What's the history of existing research building up to the need for this research? Moving on to the literature review, which is kind of the same thing, but I guess more in depth than an introduction. So let's get into the specifics of all of the different ideas we're going to discuss, the history behind those ideas, what they actually mean in this particular research context, rather. So it goes into defining resilience or resiliency, the three-factor model that was discussed in the abstract, the RSCA, which I'm not sure specifically yet, previous research. And then it goes into the methods section. A lot of people will skip over this section, which is understandable, though I don't think they should, because it's it can be very, very complex and difficult to wade through. If you're interested in research, I would say you have to just power through and grind through this section, and you have to be active when you read. There's going to be a lot of things that you won't understand. There's certainly going to be a ton of things that I'm not going to fully understand, just because I don't have that knowledge or that training yet, but skipping over it, you're never going to learn. It's kind of like you read thousands of these articles, and as you learn with your university studies and as you're exposed to these articles, you slowly start to pick things up and piece them together. As a graduate student, I would never, ever, ever recommend just blowing through this. Of course, if you want to summarize the article for someone like real quick and easy, I guess, sure. Results is different from discussion. Results is, I would say, the discussion is like the simplified summary of the results section. The results section can be quite like the methods section, where it can be very technical and a bit daunting to read. Still, for the same reason as the methods, I would recommend you read through them. If you are studying research, that is. If you're not studying research, I don't think it's 100% necessary. If you just want like the meat and potatoes, well, if you just want the summary of the findings, you don't need to go through the results or the methods. I guess you can just go to the discussion. And here's a discussion. This is like a more accessible summary of what the research design was, what the research methods were, what the research findings were, what this means for practice or future research, what this also means in terms of implications, there it is. And of course, every research article, you need to put the limitations of your research. No research is perfect. Every research has limitations. It's important to scrutinize research as you read it. Just because it's peer reviewed doesn't mean it's gospel. There are a lot of not great scales of psychological resilience out there that are published. And it's not about trashing other people's research. It's more about practicing identifying what are some holes in the research, what are some limitations in the research, and going forward, how can we build on that? How can we fill those holes, or how can we increase our understanding of this idea? And of course, we have references. And a lot of times what I'll do is if there's an idea that's cited that's particularly interesting, let's say, oh, this other assessment or this other test of or psychological resilience was used here, I will actually pull that article up and I might read through that one as well. Let's go through it. I use a color coding system, which I'll explain as I go through it. I'll just explain it right now. So I use 3 colors primarily. I'll use yellow, pink, and blue. What I use for yellow is general bits of information that I might cite as a reference, or just generally that I find important or insightful. Things, if I'm reading a paragraph, just the most important things that I want to remember in a paragraph. Blue, I will highlight any specific terms or names or titles. Let's say the Resiliency Scale for Young Adults, blue. Resiliency Scale for Children and Adolescents, blue. 3-factor model of personal resiliency, blue. Mastery, blue. Relatedness, blue. Emotional reactivity, blue. Now, what blue is, again, it's titles, it's names, it's terms. This is just so when I'm reviewing the article, I can find all of the important terms that are listed and just go straight to them. And then finally, pink. These are actions that I think are important that the researchers did. So let's see, what's the research? What are the researchers actually doing in this article? Stages of scale development and studies leading up to the current RCA are described. So they are describing these things. These are an action that the researchers are taking in this article. Let's say, provide concept support for several stages of scale development and studies leading up to the RSC. I think that's it, right? I could be wrong. And it's okay to be wrong. I'm wrong most of the time, but it's all about learning. This work is a step in a longer term academic. Okay, so let's get to it. Again, yellow, interesting information, blue, terms, pink, actions. So let's go. RSA is based on three, and you're going to see I highlight a lot. I'm really excessive, and it's something that I'm trying to improve, but I'm pretty excessive. Provides, we're going to provide construct validity, support, three-factor structure. Now, this should be pink. See, again, I'm not good at this because they're providing something. They're providing construct validity support. No, yeah, it's fine, it's fine. So there are 10 subscales, which is interesting. So you have three main factors, mastery, relatedness, emotional reactivity, and you have what I'm assuming are 10 subscales divvied up among these three factors. So mastery and a subscale is like I guess a poor conceptualization of the subscales. It's like a mini scale. Just like mastery, relatedness, emotional reactivity are factors that contribute to the resiliency scale for young adults. These subscales, 10 subscales, contribute to the factors of mastery, relatedness, and emotional reactivity. I'm going to change this back to yellow. See, this is how terrible I am at highlighting. And the reason is, so they are describing the stages of skill development and studies leading to the current RSY, but the RSYA provide construct validity support for the three-factor structure, construct validity support for the three-factor structure, and 10 subscales. Stages of scale development studies leading to the current RCA are described. Okay, it's the stages of scale development and these studies which are providing construct validity support. Okay, I finally got it. That's how long it takes me. Don't judge me. Okay, so let's go through the introduction. Transition from adolescence to adulthood brings many challenges, ranging from entering post-secondary education and job seeking to changes in relationships and concerns over long-term goals. Developmentally early adulthood represents the establishments of oneself in adult roles, such as spouse, parent, worker, community member. Okay. For some young adults, attending university, college is a stressful time due to unique emergent stressors because of increased vulnerability for exposure to challenging events. So here in the introduction, we're already tying up the foundation of why resilience is important. Attending university is stressful. Transition may be the first time away from their family. Okay. These are all different stressors. Consistently, research indicates that such transitions are a source of stress, uncertainty, and anxiety, even fear. As individuals go through a process of leaving the familiar behind and entering unfamiliar territory, okay? It's kind of like a repetition of what's already said, that's fine. It's been suggested that how well an individual copes with the transition how well an individual copes with with a transition that has or is occurring is related to how resilient that individual is. So again, I'm going to do a key word. We found resilient. How well an individual copes with a transition related to how resilient. The establishment of first-year university students' social support systems, especially during the first semester of the academic year, can be a time of social volatility and adjustment where they are meeting new people, developing new friendships, evaluating or maintaining old friendships, adjusting to separation from the family and changes in parental support, as well as acquiring knowledge of university resources and the demands of being a post-secondary student. Inability to make the transition to young adulthood in college can result in psychological costs, such as depression and anxiety, substance abuse, academic failure, program non-completion. Considering these and other costs, there is a need to assess. There is a need to assess, understand. This is a pink one, because this is what we're going to do. We're going to assess, understand, and promote. Oh man, this is bothering me. Look at that yellow thing. Personal resiliency. College students and generally. Existing assessment tools for resiliency in adults have a variety of foci and or present with inconsistent factor structures describing resiliency. So they are, again, this goes back to the idea of scrutinizing research. These existing assessment tools for resiliency are published. More than likely, I'm fairly certain they would be published in peer-reviewed journals. That does not mean fundamentally that they are good or that they are gospel. It is important to constantly be scrutinizing the work of others and of course our own work so that we can improve our research. So let's existing assessment tools for resiliency in adults. Inconsistent factor structures describing resilience. Inconsistency in the definition of resilience. And that's one thing we see with resilience frequently, is that the definition is inconsistent. My faculty advisor has an article where, to loosely quote him, he mentions that resiliency is in the eye of the beholder. And that's a pretty big problem when you have, for example, 10 different academics having different understandings rather than different definitions of resilience. It's important to consolidate, I guess, theoretical definition of the construct. So again, inconsistency in the definition of resiliency across instrument and within the same instrument across samples. So this is a problem here. Existing assessment of resiliency is inconsistent. Resiliency assessment tools for adults include ego resiliency, ER89, which focuses on ego resiliency, Connor Davidson Resiliency Scale, developed to assess the response to medication. Oh, interesting. Also the brief resilience scale, which focuses on the ability to recover. Prince Embry, Soklovsky, and Vesely review these and other scales of resiliency and related constructs, present a broader view of theoretical issues in the field. The development of the resiliency scale for young adults reported here applies the three-factor model of personal resiliency developed by Prince Embry. The resiliency scale for young adults applies the three-factor model of personal resiliency divided by Prince Emery to the struggles of young adults attending college. This work is considered as a step in the author's longer-term project of translating the construct of personal resiliency for applications across the lifespan, builds on earlier work by the authors. You first address general definitions of resilience and then the three-factor model underlying the RSYA. So this is what this article is doing. Let's do it in two parts. We will first address the general definition of resilience. Part one, that's what they're going to do. Then the three-factor model underlying the resiliency scale for young adults. And what I like to do when I find that little golden nugget that clearly states what they plan to do in the article is I like to give it a little star and I like to circle it. Okay, so first, let's define resilience. Personal resiliency. The ability to overcome and thrive in the face of obstacles or adversity is relevant throughout all stages of scale development. So this is the definition these authors are broadly assigning to personal resilience, the ability to overcome and thrive in the face of obstacles or adversity. As may be touched upon in this article, that's one definition of many definitions. And as mentioned, that's kind of part of the problem where there's so many definitions of resilience out there. But this, I would say, is pretty consistent with what I've been reading recently. Again, it's a very broad definition, but generally pretty consistent. The constructs of resiliency have been defined from multiple perspectives. And this is tedious, I know. Multiple perspectives have evolved from examining the circumstances allowing some extraordinary individuals to survive in the face of adversity, views of resilience as ordinary, but have evolved from examining the circumstances of allowing some extraordinary individuals to survive in the face of adversity to A.S. Maston's view of resilience as ordinary magic. So it's saying that this definition has evolved from examining the extraordinary individuals to ordinary magic. The perspective suggests that resiliency is based on fundamental systems already identified as characteristics of human functioning. And that it has a great adaptive significance across diverse stressors and threatening situations. In this way, Maston contends that personal resiliency applies potentially to ordinary individuals. This shift in emphasis has significant implications by extending the application of resilience theory to a broader range of individuals in varied contexts across the lifespan. Extending this view of resiliency as a trait of the individual, the emphasis has shifted from describing resilience as a dynamic process involving an interaction between the individual and the environment. Extending this view as resilience as a trait of the individual, emphasis has shifted to describing resilience as a dynamic process involving the interaction between the individual and the environment. Okay. So we're seeing resiliency as a trait that is inherent within people. describing resilience as a dynamic process involving the interaction between the individual and the environment. Luther, Cicchetti, and Becker distinguish between resilience as a dynamic developmental process, a phenomenon that involves the interaction of personal attributes with environmental circumstances, and personal resiliency as a personality characteristic of the individual. So what they're saying is resilience is not necessarily just a trait within an individual. They're starting to think as resilience as a process between the individual and environmental circumstances. So again, so far they're presenting two ideas. They're presenting the idea that resilience, the ability to overcome and thrive in the face of obstacles or adversity, is a trait, a characteristic inherent within people, but it is also the process of this characteristic within an individual, the process of that individual and their interaction with their environment. So it's a trait and a process. Several theories have attempted to elucidate the facets of resiliency, their interrelationships, as well as their underlying mechanisms, processes, and outcomes. These theories have drawn from personality, cognitive, and biological orientations, yet none to date provide a comprehensive theory of resiliency. Although many of these theories and models have been subjected to some empirical investigation, research findings are limited by various methodological shortcomings and in their generalizability. So generalizability is basically, can the research findings in this specific research or with this specific sample of individuals be generalized and applied equally accurately to other groups of people? This has resulted in a continuing lack of clarity and consensus in the definition of resilience and personal resiliency, and in the ways of operationalizing these definitions. It is with this in mind that the three-factor model of personal resiliency and associated resiliency scales for children and adolescents were developed as a working model operationalized by brief self-report assessment measure. Okay, I'm going to read this paragraph again because it's pretty important. Several theories have attempted to elucidate the facets of resiliency, their interrelationships, as well as their underlying mechanisms, processes, and outcomes. So existing research has tried to understand resilience or better conceptualize all of the different facets involved with resilience. And this previous research drawn from personality, cognitive, biological orientations, but still they cannot provide a comprehensive theory of resiliency. And this goes back to that idea that the problem of resiliency is in the eye of the beholder. There's so many different definitions, there's so many different conceptualizations, it's confusing and it hinders, I guess, an efficient way forward to understand the construct. Although many of these theories and models have been subjected to some empirical investigation, findings are limited by various methodological shortcomings and their generalizability. So people have been trying to scientifically test how accurate or reliable, let's see, how accurate these models are. But those tests may not be the best themselves, methodological shortcomings. And those tests, or those theories rather, may not be generalizable to a wider population group. This has resulted in a continuing lack of clarity and consensus in the definition of resilience and personal resiliency, and in the ways of operationalizing these definitions. So operationalizing means in the way of measuring, physically measuring, whether it's through a quiz or a questionnaire, whether it's through observations, measuring these definitions. It is with this in mind that the three-factor model of personal resiliency and associated resiliency scale for children and adolescents were developed as a working model, operationalized, measured by a brief self-report assessment measure. So brief self-report assessment measure, basically fancy word for brief questionnaire. I'm going to go through it one more time, and this time I'm going to highlight stuff. Okay. So because there's such a lack of consensus surrounding resilience, and because there's so many shortcomings attempting to measure resilience, the authors, Prince Embury et al., have historically developed this resiliency scales for children and adolescents to try to fix that shortcoming or that problem. Now they are going to, I'm assuming, discuss their definition or their operationalization of resilience, the three-factor model of personal resilience. Three-factor model of personal resilience is based on previously identified aspects of personal experience related to three core developmental systems. These are sense of mastery, sense of relatedness, and emotional reactivity. And the relationship of these factors to one another, okay? Draws from an extensive review of the resilience literature. Okay. And from A.S. Maston's suggestion that resilience builds on basic developmental systems. The model operationalization RSCA has been supported by comparing the fit of 1, 2, and 3 factor structures for normative samples of children and adolescents. Okay. So again, I'm not a pro. I'm not a PhD. So I could be wrong in my understanding of this sentence, but this is how I understand it. The model measured, the model of measurement used in the RSCA has been supported by comparing the fit of 1, 2, and 3 factor structures. So what that means is they did what's called a factor analysis. And I'm assuming it's an exploratory factor analysis where they gave a quiz out or an assessment out, and they got the responses and they put it through, I guess, a program, a computer software program, and they asked that software, okay, how are the responses clustered? Are they clustered to all indicate one big idea that resilience is, for example, just a sense of mastery? Or are they clustered between 2 ideas? Or are they clustered between 3 different ideas? It's probably not the best explanation. how are responses to questions in this assessment? Yeah, I guess. What are the patterns of responses to questions in this assessment? And when you look at how responses to different questions tend to be related to each other, how people tend to rate questions, for example, 2, 12, 24, 30, 34, similarly. And then they also tend to rate questions, people tend to generally relate questions 7, 15, whatever, similarly. And another set of questions similarly. And there are 3 big sets that we've come to. And they are testing whether, oh man, this is so hard to explain. I didn't think it would be this hard to explain this kind of concept. And I guess that shows that my understanding of it is still limited. But essentially they're trying to determine whether the questions are measuring one big idea, the questions are measuring 2 different ideas, or 3 different ideas. That's what they mean by comparing the fit of 1, 2, and 3 factor structures for normative samples of children and adolescents. So again, the model operationalized in the RSCA has been supported by, oops. Comparing the fit of 1, 2, and 3 factor structures for normative samples of children and adolescents. Oops, that's okay, we don't need it. And by an analysis of measurement invariance across gender and age. Convergent and so actually, let's go back to that one point. By analysis of measurement invariance across gender and age. My understanding is that means they are trying to determine whether responses between specific gender groups and specific age groups have whether response patterns between gender groups and age groups have statistically significant differences, or whether response patterns across genders and age are not different. They're the same. So whether gender and age actually makes a difference in how people respond. Convergent and divergent validity. Have been provided for each of the factors represented by the 3 global RSCA scales, including their ability to differentiate children and adolescents with clinical diagnoses from matched control samples. Core aspects of the 3-factor model are described below, along with links to other pivotal resilience-related concepts in research. Okay, so let's go through the second part again. Convergent and divergent validity. Convergent validity is generally, my understanding of it, a general explanation of it is, let's say we have 2 different measures, 2 different ways that we're measuring personal resilience. One's an established way, or let's say, for example, one way is established. We know this way has historically been used to measure resilience or measure an idea that's very similar to resilience. Well, people who take our new test score similarly to people who take this existing test or this other way to measure resilience. If we can prove that they both intend to measure the same thing and they both actually are measuring the same thing, given the similarity or consistency of actual scores reported on both instruments, then we have convergent validity. Divergent validity is the opposite of that. So if I'm measuring psychological resilience, how would I explain this? The responses in my measure of psychological resilience should not be systematically similar to responses in a measure of how much I like going out for Sundays or pizza every weekend. Those things have nothing to do with each other, or should have nothing to do with each other. So that's a terrible example, but so we would expect scores on those quizzes, how much I like to go out for ice cream and what my psychological resilience is, to be different. That's divergent validity. We expect it to diverge from each other. It's a terrible example, I apologize. Convergent and divergent validity have been provided for each of the factors represented, including their ability to differentiate children and adolescents with clinical diagnoses from matched control samples. Core aspects of the three-factor model are described below, along with links to other pivotal resilience-related constructs. Okay, so their ability to differentiate children and adolescents is, I would say, an example of, it depends. If we expect, let's say if previous literature or some previous scale sorry, I'm thinking this through. Let's say that previous literature suggests that children and adolescents with clinical diagnoses have historically had similar levels of resilience, or have historically responded in similar ways. If our measure, man, that might not be right, sorry, let me think. Convergent and divergent validity have been provided for each of the factors represented, including their ability to differentiate children and adolescents. So if we expect children and adolescents to be different in terms of their psychological resilience, if some historical or extant literature has indicated there is a difference measured, and ours, we expect it to measure with, or we expect it to differ with our tests, and it actually does differ, then that would be what I would assume is divergent validity, because we are expecting the test scores to be different in this regard, and they are different in this regard. And maybe it's an example of convergent validity because those things are like two sides of the same coin, where if we expect scores of children to be consistent throughout these different measures, because they're children, they should have similar scores. And that may be an example of convergent validity. And then again, comparing children and adolescents historically, since we expect them to have different scores, when they do have different scores, maybe that's what they mean by establishing divergent validity. Again, I'm not a professional. I'm just working through this in my own mind as I go. Core aspects of the three-factor model are described below, along with links to other pivotal resilience-related concepts in research. Okay, that's what they're doing. Okay, let's start with sense of mastery, one of the three factors in their resilience scale. One cluster of constructs consistently identified as important for developmental and resilience research include mastery, competence, and self-efficacy. So I'm assuming this is where they're drawing their definition for what a sense of mastery is. White suggested that an individual's sense of competence or efficacy provides him or her with the opportunity to interact and enjoy cause and effect relationships in the environment. Cause and effect. I think this should be an E. It is driven by an innate curiosity that is intrinsically rewarding and is a source of problem-solving skills. Okay. Individuals' sense of competence or efficacy provides opportunity to interact with, enjoy cause and effect relationships. Driven by an innate curiosity that is intrinsically rewarding, the source of problem solving. Okay. So then what is sense of mastery? So then sense of mastery, extending from that thought, involves optimism or a positive view about the future and oneself, self-efficacy, or the belief that one can master his or her environment. And adaptability, reflecting the ability to adjust oneself and one's behavior when necessary. Sense of mastery represents a key protective factor of personal resiliency. And this is what I mean by I'm really can be a bit redundant with my highlighting. This entire paragraph is extremely, I think, important. So I basically highlighted the whole thing. Maybe you didn't need to. I'm also going to take some notes because now we're getting into like the meat and bones of it. Don't forget this. Don't forget this. Okay, so let's read that again. Mastery, confidence, self-efficacy, an individual sense of competency, opportunity to interact and enjoy cause and effect relationships, and is driven by innate curiosity that is intrinsically rewarding and a sense of problem solving. Sense of mastery involves optimism or a positive view about the future and oneself. Self-efficacy or the belief that one can master his or her environment. Adaptability, reflecting the ability to adjust oneself and one's behavior when necessary. So, sense of mastery is optimism or positive view about the future and oneself, self-efficacy, belief that one can master his or her environment. Adaptability reflects. That first part to me sounds a lot like confidence, but also the adaptability reflecting the ability to adjust oneself and one's behavior when necessary. So if I have a sense of mastery, I'm optimistic, I have a positive view about the future and myself, about the fact that I can master my own environment, and that I can adapt and adjust myself and my behavior when it's necessary. If I have a sense of mastery, apparently it's a protective factor of personal resilience, so it protects me from whatever it is that's in my environment or in my future that I'm going to need to adapt to. Okay. So next, let's go to sense of relatedness. Reviewing 5 decades of resilience research in child development, Luther concluded, resilience rests fundamentally on relationships. The importance of relationships has been noted in every major review of protective factors. Okay. So relationships, my understanding is not resilience. Relationship is what I might consider maybe a moderator of resilience or a covariate of resilience. So let's say I have good personal relationships with other people. I have a strong support system in my life. That helps me feel like the future is going to be good, that I have control over my environment, that I can adapt and I can adjust to the environment or to the future if I need to, because I have these positive relationships. But relationships, it's not necessarily resilience. It might affect one's level of resilience at a certain time, but having relationships does not necessarily mean that it's not the same thing as resilience, if that makes any sense. It's like, I like to use this example, but let's say I have a body temperature, right? What's the average human body temperature? Let's see. Adults, 36, okay, let's say my average human body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, right? That's my average resilience. Let's say I have a good support structure in my home. I have great friends. I just have a lot of support. If I'm put in a tough position, let's say I have to go out in a blizzard, my body temperature is 37, that blizzard's cold, that environment, that adversity that I'm facing is tough, and it might lower my, temporarily, as long as I'm in that environment, lower my sense of resilience. But if I have a strong support structure, if I have clothes, I might be able to insulate myself from that environment. But the second that I take off that clothes, again, that environment's going to affect me. So I don't think that, and I have not read this paragraph yet, so who knows what he's going to say. I could be completely wrong, but my understanding is relationships, sure, resilience rests fundamentally on relationships. I don't disagree with that, but I don't think that relationships are inherently resilience. Relationships can moderate or can affect our level of resilience, but a jacket is not my personal body temperature. A jacket might affect temporarily, affect my body temperature. But as soon as that jacket comes off, my body temperature is going to go back to what it was. If that terrible, terrible example makes any sense. Okay, let's go. Luther concluded resilience rests fundamentally on relationships. The importance of relationships has been noted in every major review of protective factors of resilience, okay? Furthermore, the position of relationships and relational ability as mediators of resilience, okay, has been supported in developmental psychopathology research. I agree that relationships are a mediator of resilience. Prince Emery's conceptualization of relatedness includes a sense of trust, perceived access to support and comfort, and tolerance of others. Hence, sense of relatedness represents a second protective factor of personal resiliency. I don't know. So again, sense of relatedness itself is not resilience. So you're measuring, essentially, my opinion is, they're measuring a covariate of resilience and they're conflating it with resilience. If that makes sense. Having a sense of relatedness may affect resilience, sure, but it's not resilience. I said a moderator, they said a mediator. Okay. They know better than I, so let's continue. Conceptualizations of relatedness, okay. Includes sense of trust, perceived access to support. Oops. Comfort with tolerance of others. Comfort with tolerance of, okay. So relatedness, their definition is I have a sense of trust with my peers or whoever's in my social support group. I believe that I have access to support from those around me. And I'm comfortable with and tolerant of those around me. I swear it usually doesn't take me this long to go through an article. I'm just going slow. Don't judge me. I'm just going slow. Hence, sense of relatedness represents a second protective factor of resiliency. I wish they would define protective factor a bit more clearly because I'm an idiot. Okay, so again, don't forget this. It's important. Don't forget this. But also, I don't know if I agree. Okay, let's go to emotional reactivity. Developmental research has demonstrated that behavioral maladjustment and the development of pathology in the presence of adversity are related to both emotional reactivity and the inability to regulate this reactivity. Emotional reactivity is the individual's arousability or the threshold of tolerance that exists prior to the occurrence of adverse events or circumstances. So one thing with resilience, my current understanding of resilience is inherently tied to what they call adverse events. That's where you really show resilience. It's what, are you going to show resilience in your day-to-day? Going through life, everything's going smoothly. Oops, you dropped your sandwich. Most people don't have complete meltdowns to minor inconveniences in life. So it's hard to tie in resilience in situations that don't include adversity. Usually when one conceptualizes resilience is, wow, my family member passed away, or wow, I just got fired from my job, or wow, part of my job deals with having to help families make decisions to say goodbye to their loved ones. Or maybe I'm the one who has to say goodbye to my loved one. Those are significantly adverse events or circumstances that people have to go through. And it is within these circumstances that people maybe not rely upon, but people exhibit their resilience. Or within the process definition of resilience, it is within these adverse situations in these environments that the interaction between the person and the environment shows that person's resilience. Emotional reactivity is the individual's arousability or threshold of tolerance that exists prior to the occurrence of adverse events or circumstances, before the occurrence of adversity. Rothbard and Derryberry have defined emotional reactivity as the speed and intensity of an individual's negative emotional response. Prince Embury further describes 3 functional aspects of emotional reactivity: sensitivity, length of recovery time from emotional upset, and impairment or degree disrupted functioning related to emotional upset. And impairment or degree of disrupted functioning. We're going to go through this one again too. Ooh, what a mess. Look at this. Terrible highlighting. Emotional reactivity represents a vulnerability factor. Okay, so it's not a protective factor. We have protective factors and we have vulnerability factors. I wish they would clearly define what a protective factor is and what a vulnerability factor is. I'm assuming protective factors are those first two factors, sense of mastery, sense of relatedness, that contributes to someone's resilience in adversity. And I'm assuming emotional reactivity is something that hurts the ability of someone to navigate these adverse circumstances. So we're going to do protective factor. And I promise my notes are terrible, but I will remember what this question mark means, especially if I read the paragraph again. And this is a vulnerability factor. Okay, let's go through it again. Emotional reactivity, behavioral maladjustment, and the development of pathology in the presence of adversity are related to both emotional reactivity, again, behavioral adjustment, development, pathology, are related to both. What a mess of a paragraph. Look at my terrible highlighting. This is why, oops. Oh, crud. Oh, shit. Look at that. The threshold of tolerance. Okay, so behavioral maladjustment and the development of pathology in the presence of adversity are related to emotional reactivity, inability to regulate this reactivity. So when someone's faced with an adverse situation, their emotional reactivity and their inability to regulate it is related to maladjustment and pathology. And this emotional reactivity is an individual's arousability and their threshold of tolerance that exists prior to the occurrence of the adverse event. So how much we can handle, basically. How much shit we can handle before we start to fall apart. Excuse my language, I'm sorry. How much inconvenience or pain or suffering or distress we can handle. Emotional reactivity, the speed and intensity of an individual's negative emotional response. So if I'm in a tough situation, I'm cornered by, I'm out in like the Alaskan wilderness and I have my camp set up and I realize, whoa, I'm running out of food and fresh water fast. How quickly does it take me to fall apart? I think that's what this is talking about. Or let's say I've heard news that my loved one was in a car accident. I don't know if they're okay or not. How quickly am I going to fall apart? Am I going to fall apart? Or am I going to hold it together, at least for the time being? Am I going to be able to do the things that I need to do? or am I just going to fall apart? I think that's what this is talking about. Okay, I don't have any questions about this one. So let's just review the three-factor model. What they're saying is there are three main categories that make up personal resilience: a sense of mastery, an optimism or positivity or a confidence about ourselves and the future, about that we're in control of the environment, and that we're able to, our own perception, that we're able to adapt and adjust our behavior when necessary. And then we have a sense of relatedness, which is the sense of trust that we have. I'm sorry, it is a sense of trust that we have in others around us and our perceptions that we can rely upon others for support, and our level of comfort and tolerance with others. This one I have a question about. I don't think this one is actual resilience. Then we have emotional reactivity. How much pain can we take before we fall apart? Or how long can we carry that burden and keep walking forward before we start to fall apart? And they're saying these three things are what make up personal resiliency. Okay, let's go to RSCA. The RSCA was developed for children and adolescents ages 9 through 18 years, comprised of 3 global scales. So 3 global scales, so 3 different measurement instruments, 3 different questionnaires, whatever, on the 3-factor model of personal resiliency. Again, we have sense of, I'm not going to blue this one out. I don't want to blue myself. Each of these factors is comprised of subscales. So we have 3 factors: sense of mastery, sense of relatedness, emotional reactivity. And these 3 factors are made up of other smaller factors or other smaller subscales or smaller ways to measure these factors. So sense of mastery includes optimism, self-efficacy, and adaptability. They're saying that sense of mastery is measured by one's level of optimism, their level of self-efficacy, and their perceived level of adaptability. Sense of relatedness, comprised of trust, comfort with others, support, and tolerance. So that's 4. 3, 4, that's 7. Emotional reactivity is going to have 3 because there's 10 total, right? Is defined by sensitivity, recovery, and impairment. So again, these 3 factors, sense of mastery, sense of relatedness, emotional reactivity, are measured by or defined by 3 mini factors: optimism, self-efficacy, adaptability for sense of mastery, trust, comfort with others, support and tolerance for sense of relatedness, sensitivity, recovery, and impairment for emotional reactivity. What this means is that resilience is the combination of one's optimism, self-efficacy, adaptability, trust, comfort with others, support, tolerance, sensitivity, recovery, and impairment. That's what they're saying resilience is. RSCA was standardized for 3 age groups, okay? Stratified by ethnicity, interesting. Parent education level, than age group and gender. Although RSCA was developed for children and adolescents and awarded at a third grade reading level, the intention was to allow for further scale development, longitudinal analysis of aspects of personal resiliency based on the underlying three-factor structure. Thus, the RSCA allows for assessment of three personal resiliency factors individually and relative to one another, and a more differentiated assessment of personal resilience than assessments that measure it in a single score. So they're saying that their measure is more comprehensive and more elaborate and more maybe sensitive, I don't know if that's the right word, than other existing measurements. And that's based on the idea that they're measuring three different factors that they claim is related to resilience, or they claim comprises resilience. Also, the RSCA supports a more factorial, consistent model of personal resilience and other assessments, than other assessments. Development of the RSYA reported here represents the continuation of the previous research goal of exploring personal resilience, More specifically, the work reported here explores how the RSCA, building from the early, may be used to explore personal resilience in young adults attending college. Attending college, that's very specific. That means this might be an accurate test or measurement of resilience in young adults attending college, but not in young adults in a sports team, or young adults dealing with the death of a family member, or young adults who are sent overseas for deployment. It's a very specific thing that they're measuring. And this is coming back to the idea of generalizability. Just because this is an accurate test to measure personal resilience in young adults attending college does not, by definition, mean that it will also be equally an accurate test of personal resiliency in maybe expats overseas, or again, young adults deployed in a country for war. So I'm just going to put a little mark here so don't forget. For example, those who have a higher sense of mastery, particularly self-efficacy, may approach the challenges of academic demands, greater autonomy, independence with more confidence. Effective coping skills in those with, contends that an individual's internalized expectancies of his or her own efficacy affect how he or she interacts with ongoing circumstances, So the first experience for students attending college or university involves leaving their pre-existing support network and entering a new environment where new friends and support systems need to be creative. Youth with a higher sense of relatedness. Let's just make a notation of all of these so I can quickly follow it through a glance. Youth with a higher sense of relatedness, including sense of trust, tolerance, comfort with others, may make this social transition more easily than those with. So is that resilience though, or is that ability to transition? That's my question. Are we still measuring resilience? Or are we trying to say the ability to transition is somehow related to overall resilience? Again, this is my problem with sense of relatedness. Young adults who embark on this transition with high emotional reactivity may find themselves more emotionally challenged in the new environment. Heightened emotional reactivity may in turn manifest itself in psychological or physical symptoms or acting out behaviors. I'm going to think for 1 second, I'm sorry. So this, just to keep in the forefront of my mind, this might explain why they're measuring sense of relatedness. This is not a measure of resilience as a personal characteristic or a trait. This is a measure of resilience, the resilience as a process of an individual's ability to interact with their environment or with adversity that comes in interaction with the environment. So it's measuring resilience, again, as a process of one's ability to navigate this interaction. And it's saying sense of mastery helps navigate this process. Sense of relatedness helps navigate this process. Emotional reactivity affects navigation of this process. I think that's the biggest thing that I need to remember. I always think of resilience. I'm so used to thinking of resilience as a trait or a state that people find themselves in, or a trait inherent within an individual, or a state, a temporary state that people find themselves in. But as a process, resilience as a process of interacting with an environment or adversity within that environment. Resilience in our interaction. When we have confidence in our ability to adapt, or perceive or perception that we're efficacious, we're more resilient. We're able to navigate. Man, this is confusing. This is very confusing for me. Let's carry on. Resiliency or lack thereof in any of these dimensions may have implications for academic success. I don't know if this is an issue with my inability to fully wrap my head around this, or if this is an issue that they're not measuring the right thing. Implications for academic success. So what they're saying is, if a young adult is in a life transition, they're moving from their home to a college dorm, they're losing their existing or much of their existing comfort of support and familiarity, thrust into this new environment. Resilient individuals will likely be more academically successful. Those who are not resilient will not be. So how do we know if someone's going to be resilient in this environment? Resilient throughout this process is if they have a sense of mastery, they're more likely to be resilient throughout this transition. If they have a sense of relatedness, they're more likely to be resilient throughout this transition. If they are not as emotionally reactive, they're likely to be more resilient throughout this transition. And let's go back to their definition of resilience. The ability to overcome and thrive in the face of obstacles or adversity. And that is trait-based resilience. So that idea of trait-based resilience has evolved. Oh, wait, where was that? Resilience as a trait has shifted. The emphasis has shifted to describing resilience as a dynamic process involved. So this is super important that I didn't pick up on before. See, it's important. Describing resilience not just as a trait within the individual, a process involving an interaction between the individual and the environment. So the interaction between these young adults as they transition to college life. Luther, Cecchetti, Becker distinguish between resilience as a dynamic developmental process or phenomenon that involves the interaction of personal attributes. So these personal attributes might be sense of mastery, emotional reactivity. It's the last one again, sense of relatedness. Personal attributes with the environmental circumstances. Oh, I'm sorry, personal. This is a very, I'm going to put a little question mark here because I have a question about this one as well. This is a huge sentence to unpack. So let's do our best so we can understand the rest of the article. Luther, Cecchetti, and Becker distinguished between, so there's two, they're distinguishing between resilience as a dynamic developmental process or phenomenon that involves the interaction of personal attributes with environmental circumstances and personal resiliency as a personality characteristic of the individual. Okay, so it's just worded weird. So it's saying there's a difference between resilience as a dynamic developmental process or phenomenon that involves the interaction of personal attributes with the environmental circumstance. There's a difference between that and the idea of personal resiliency as a personal characteristic of the individual. So this, I'm going to distinguish it between this. There are two different things here. And what's happening in this article is they're looking at resilience not as a personality characteristic of the individual, but as a dynamic developmental process or phenomenon that involves the interaction of personal attributes, again, those three factors, with environmental circumstances. Okay. I'm still questionable about the sense of relatedness, though. So going back, it says resiliency or lack thereof in any of these dimensions may have implications for academic success in post-secondary settings. Higher sense of mastery may lead to seeking more effective academic skills, greater effort to achieve successfully in coursework. Okay. Increased sense of relatedness. Realize forming and maintaining of friendships and this. Okay. So I think I was wrong about sense of relatedness. Sense of relatedness is not the existing support. but the ability to form and maintain support. Which I guess I'm still not 100% convinced on that one. Okay. Lower emotional reactivity. Yeah, I think this one sounds, face value sounds right. Work reported here represents the first step in establishing the RSYA. So what they're doing here, they're coming up with what is called a theoretical definition of the construct. So they're saying in order for us to measure resilience as a process, we first need to come to a very clear definition of what resilience as a process is and what ideas make up resilience as a process. And once we've come to this clear definition, the very specific ideas that make up resilience as a process, then we can start to operationalize this definition or start to come up with a way to measure this definition with numbers. Measure this definition within people and assign numbers to that measurement, at least. The work reported here represents the first step in establishing the RSYA as a tool for further research. Previous research in the developmental So this is not the current study. This is a previous study. Oh, yeah. So previous research. So this is still part of the lit review. Previous research in the development of the RSYA. Initial research explored applicability of the original RSCA and a slightly adapted version with young adult college student populations. As with the original RSCA, 3 global factors form the foundation of the scales. Okay, these are all the same. They're same. First phase of development, creation of 2 young adult versions of the RSCA, which was essentially the same as the RSCA, with only 2 items altered to be more appropriate for adults. The word parents was replaced by family on the support subscale, and this was followed by a revised version titled Additional adaptability items. Adaptability was chosen as an area to expand in the young adult version, consistent with the finding that flexible coping was more adaptive for college students. Adaptability is represented in the original RSCAs, the degree to which children and adolescents can learn from their mistakes. Okay. The degree to which they can let others help when needed. Also, the original adaptability subscale had only 3 items. Added to this subscale were provisional items more appropriate to this adults. As opportunities for new learning and growth. Findings supported the addition of these new items to the revised adaptability subscale for inclusion in the next phase of developing a resilience scale for young adults. Okay. Following the studies of these preliminary adult versions of the scale with 2 samples of university students, a review of the findings focused on whether the factor structures of the RSCA and RSCAAR were acceptable and consistent with that of the original RSCA. So basically, they updated their test a little bit. They changed the wording of some items. They added some questions to adaptability. And they tested it out in a pilot, I'm assuming, with 635 students between the ages of 18 to 25 years to determine how consistent this young adult model was with the, assuming it was the child model. Whether the alpha coefficients for the scales and subscales were satisfactory. So alpha coefficient, my understanding is internal consistency, the degree to which, how do we explain this? Sorry, I'm thinking 1 second. I'm going to think about how I'm going to try to explain this in the best way that I can. Okay, let's start with the loose and broad definition, and then I'm going to try to work my understanding of it. Somehow I'm confusing myself about this. The internal consistency is the degree to which responses, items in a test, the degree to which people respond to them consistently. So if, for example, adaptability, let's take adaptability. The degree to which we can let others help is needed. The degree to which children and adolescents can learn from their mistakes. So let's say we have some questions about learning from your mistakes and the degree to which helping others, letting others help us when needed. I let other people help me when needed. I'm open to the idea of seeking support. I let other people help me when needed. I'm open to the idea of seeking support. I appreciate when people give input. I think I can learn from others. We would expect people to respond. If someone responded yes to 1 or very strongly agreed to 1, we would expect them to respond strongly agree to the others. Within that scale. And when you have questions that are designed to measure the same thing, such as degree to which they can let others help as needed. Let's say we have 5 questions. They're all trying to measure the degree to which we can let others help as needed, but in different wordings and from different angles. But we still expect people to respond similarly to all 5 of these questions. If my understanding is the alpha coefficient, let's say it's 0.88, that means when responding to these questions, people generally, let's say 1 is 100%. Man, I know I'm not explaining this in the best way, but let's just say a high alpha coefficient means that people were responding, means that questions are, geez Louise. high alpha coefficient for a scale and for a subscale means that for questions that we have that are intended to measure a specific idea, such as the degree to which one can let others help is needed. These questions, responses to these questions, should be consistent. If I respond strongly agree to one question and the rest of the 4 questions are measuring the same thing, I should be responding strongly agree to those other questions. If I have a question in there, let's say I'm trying to measure the degree to which one can let others help is needed. I have a question like, I'm open to others letting others helping me if I need help. I will seek input from others. I hate Mondays. What? What is I hate Mondays doing in there? That's not a question that actually measures the degree to which one can let others help is needed. That would lower the consistency of responses because you have people consistently responding like, yeah, I strongly agree. I seek out opinions of others or help from others when needed. Yeah, I'm open to letting other people give me input. Mondays, Jenny might say no when she said highly agree to the rest of the questions. Rupert might say maybe when he said highly agree to the rest of the questions. It's just a question that doesn't measure the actual construct. And when you have questions that all measure what they're supposed to measure, people tend to reply or answer those questions with consistently similar responses. And when they do, they have what's called a high alpha coefficient. And I know I've taken, like 20 minutes to try to explain this concept because I'm terrible at explaining things, but what they're basically saying is they measured the alpha, they did this calculation, this statistical calculation to measure the degree to which responses were consistent, the degree to which responses were consistent as intended within scales and subscales. So again, we're going to start with this paragraph. Following from studies of these preliminary adult versions of this scale with 2 samples of university students, a review of the findings focused on whether the factor structures, those 3 factors of the RSCAA and RSCAAR, were acceptable and consistent with that of the original RSCA. Whether the alpha coefficients for the scales and subscales were satisfactory, whether the relationship with other theoretically related variables were in the predicted direction. So whether the responses indicate that our questions are actually measuring the ideas or the concepts or the constructs that we designed our questions to actually measure. These criteria were all met to completion. Geez, it took me forever with that one. Phase 2 of this study. Phase 2 of the scale development introduced new trial items with more adult-focused wording, but which were consistent with the core underlying constructs of the RSCAAR. Okay, so more adult-focused wording were consistent with the core underlying constructs. So those constructs could be the 3 factors or the 10 different subscales that make up the 3 factors. Further items were generated. A 105 item version, geez, that's kind of a lot, was administered to a 3rd sample of Canadian university students. Results were examined to determine the internal consistency. A different word for alpha coefficient is internal consistency. So they're basically talking about the same thing, and the factor structure, which they talked about a bit before, whether resilience can best be defined by one idea, by two ideas, by three ideas. They settle on those three factors. The intention was to try out new items that might improve the previous scale, and then to shorten the overall number of items per subscale to 5. That makes sense about the 105. Based on exploratory factor analysis, both the items and the corresponding 10 subs based on exploratory factor analyses of both the items and the corresponding 10 subscales, all but 9 of the newly introduced items were eliminated, along with 23 of the original. Based on an exploratory factor analysis, of both the items and the corresponding 10 subscales, all but 9 of the newly introduced. That's very interesting to me. Probably just because I don't have that experience yet, but my understanding is exploratory factor analysis is used to determine broad definition, terrible definition, used to determine the best number of different ideas that make up what's being measured in a test. So we have 100 questions. Are these 100 questions all measuring, probably all measuring sense of mastery, or all measuring one idea? Or are the questions being clustered into 2 groups to measure 2 ideas, clustered into 3 groups to measure 3 ideas? You can name the ideas whatever you think is most appropriate based on the actual question clusterings. But I think that I would expect them to have done a principal components analysis. I'm going to put a question mark here. A PCA, my understanding is, let's say you have a bunch of questions and you're looking for redundancy in those questions. You're trying to say oh, we have 100 questions, or we have 33 questions for this one factor, 33 questions for another factor, 33 for a third factor. Do we really need 33? Or can we get similar consistency with responses, or similarly valid, or similar consistency with responses if we cut it down to 10? What's the lowest number of questions that we can have while still maintaining the consistency and the integrity of the test? So here they based on an exploratory factor analysis of both the items and corresponding 10 subscales. All but 9 of the newly introduced items were eliminated. That sounds like a principal components analysis to me. I guess they're kind of like the same thing in a sense, along with 23 of the original RSCA items. Which resulted in a 50-item scale, renamed the RSYA. Current 50-item RSYA included 41 of the original RSCA items, the new adaptability subscale, and modified versions of optimism. modified versions of the optimism and tolerance subscales. The current version of the RSYA includes 5 items for each of the 10 subscales, comprising the 3-factor model. Five items for each of the 10 subscales. Each item is responded to on a 5-point scale, never to almost, always. The format for the RSYA was modified, mixing items reflecting mastery, relatedness, and emotional reactivity to reduce the possible influence of the response set. In the current study, this one is important. This current study follows from the preceding scale development intended to confirm the factor structure of the 50-item RSYA. So I'm assuming they're going to do a confirmatory factor analysis. The study will examine the internal consistency, reliability of the 3 main factors and 10 subscales of the RSYA. Confirmatory factor analysis was used to replicate the factor structure found in the previous studies and followed with an examination of the convergent and discriminant. This is kind of a pet peeve, but earlier on in the article, oh yeah, they do it. Convergent, divergent validity, convergent and divergent validity, convergent, divergent validity. And then they use discriminant, convergent and discriminant validity. I'm assuming these different sections are written by different people. Discriminant validity basically is the same thing as divergent validity, followed with an examination of the convergent and RSYA. Based on a large literature review, we hypothesized that the RSYA protective factor, sense of mastery and relatedness would correlate positively with measures of well-being and negatively with measures of negative affect. So that's an example of convergent and discriminant or divergent validity, where convergent validity is saying that if someone has high levels of a sense of mastery and relatedness, they should, by definition, also have high levels of related ideas, such as well-being. And they should, by definition, have low levels of related ideas that are in the opposite direction or on the opposite spectrum, such as negative affect. I guess, and it depends on how, what I've heard is that it depends on how strictly you define convergent and discriminant validity, but some people will say, no. If you want to really measure convergent validity, you can't compare it to correlates. Let's say I wanted to measure the convergent validity of sense of mastery and relatedness, and I think those ideas are systematically related to well-being. So I'm going to set up well-being as another test and measure how consistently the responses of mastery, relatedness correlate with responses to well-being, and that's how I'm going to establish convergent validity. Some people will say sure, and other maybe, I don't know if they're more traditional researchers might say no. If you want to measure convergent validity, you need to measure sense of mastery to other scales that intend to measure the exact same construct. At least that's what I've heard. But in this case, it looks like they're taking more of a more liberal or lenient definition of convergent validity. So again, we hypothesize that RSOA protected factors would correlate positively with measures of well-being and negatively with measures of, I hope that they do define well-being or operationalize the definition of well-being. I'm sorry, provide a theoretical definition of well-being and negative affect, because that would make things a lot clearer. In addition, we expected emotional reactivity to correlate positive with measures of negative affect and negatively correlate negatively with measures of negative. So this is their, I'm going to call their hypothesis or research question. In this case, it seems to be a hypothesis. And then let's do a quick review, and I'm going to end this video because it's getting super long. And then I'll progress to part 2. I'm going to get some more coffee. Then in the next video, we'll progress to part 2. But let's review what we have done. So, abstract. This article is about the resiliency scale for young adults. It's an extension of the resiliency scale for children and adolescents. The RSYA is based on 3-factor model of personal resiliency. Factor A, mastery. Factor B, relatedness. Factor C, emotional reactivity. They describe the stages of scale development and studies leading up to the current measure, which provide the construct validity support for using 3 factors and for using 10 subscales that comprise the 3 factors. So they give a little bit of the background within the context of young adulthood and why it's important to measure resilience for young adults in a life transition, moving on to college. They state that the inability to make the transition can result in psychological costs, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, academic failure, program non-completion, and that's why they need to assess and understand personal resilience. And another reason, existing measurements have inconsistent factor structures. Inconsistency in the definition of resilience across instruments. So they want to create a measure that is a bit more consistent with the different factors used to measure resilience. These are other resilience scales which have been used up until recently. The author's resilience scale for young adults applies 3-factor model of personal resilience to the struggles of young adults attending college. They address the general definition of resilience, then the 3-factor model underlying their resiliency scale. So very broad definition of personal resilience, the ability to overcome and thrive in the face of obstacles or adversity. Problem, it's been defined from multiple perspectives, confusing, and they're going to consolidate that to an extent, attempt to in their own study, this article. Resilience has previously been defined as a trait of an individual, but the emphasis, they state, has shifted to resiliency as a dynamic process involving an interaction between an individual and their environment. So in this article, they're not measuring resilience as a trait, they're measuring resilience as that dynamic process. Historically, there have been theories that attempt to elucidate facets of resilience, but none provide rather a comprehensive theory. So they're limited by methodological shortcomings and in their generalizability. I think this is questionable because this measure itself seems quite limited in generalizability, but we'll progress either way. Continuing a lack of clarity and consensus with the definition of resilience. Again, resilience has been in the eye of the beholder. That's a problem. Resilience, historically, in the past, they developed the resiliency scale for children and adolescents as a working model operationalized by a brief self-report assessment measure. They use a 3-factor model. They think that personal resiliency contains the factors of mastery, relatedness, and emotional reactivity. They think that mastery is one's ability to have a positive view or confidence about oneself and the future, about positive perceptions of one's self-efficacy, the positive perception that one can master their environment and can adapt and adjust to behavior when necessary. Resilience is a protective factor mastery is a protective factor in their sense of resiliency. Relatedness, defined by a sense of trust, perceived access to support, comfort, and tolerance of others. Again, another protective factor in resiliency. Emotional reactivity, basically how much bull squash we can tolerate before we start to melt down. It's a vulnerable factor within the 3-factor model. The intentions to allow further scale development. So this is just one step in a lot of studies that they're doing. They think that sense of mastery will help make social transitions more easy. Sense of mastery, internalized expectancies of one's own efficacy can affect how that person interacts with circumstances and may contribute to them doing better in the transition to school or to university. Sense of relatedness can also improve that or help that transition because it allows people, it indicates that people has the tools to build necessary support. Emotional reactivity may negatively affect that transition because it might be harder for people with higher emotional reactivity to deal with the struggles of that transition. They went through several studies in the past, and this is how they validated their previous measures and how they started to update their previous measure to the young adult version. And they come to a 50-item model in the resiliency scale in young adults. And how they're going to validate this model is first, they're going to perform a confirmatory factor analysis to see how consistent their initial exploratory factor analysis was. They're going to use a confirmatory factor analysis to determine how accurate their exploratory factor analysis was. So they're gonna take the 3 factors that they found in the exploratory factor analysis. They use those 3 factors to develop this 50-item scale. They're gonna give that scale to participants. Then they're gonna do a confirmatory factor analysis to confirm whether or not 3 factors are actually best suited as the previous exploratory factor analysis indicated. Then they're going to attempt to establish convergent and discriminant validity by correlating responses in their RSLA with responses of measures of well-being and negative affect. They hypothesize that a sense of mastery and the sense of relatedness will correlate highly, strong positive correlation, with well-being, and a negative correlation with negative affect. That is convergent/discriminant validity. Similarly, they expect that emotional reactivity will have a negative correlation with well-being and a positive correlation with negative affect. Again, convergent/discriminant or divergent validity. And that's it for this video. My voice is getting hoarse. I need some more coffee. I will see you in the next video. How do I end this? Farewell, my friends. Thank you for tolerating me. Bye until the next video.